Morning, Andy.
Andy Burnham is on his first international trip as Prime Minister of the UK, and it's to Ukraine. And he's handing over blueprints to allow Ukraine to make their own long-range missiles that can be fired into Russian territory. And is President Zelensky under political pressure more than ever before inside his own country? We'll discuss on this episode of Newscast. Hello, please welcome back to the Newscast studio, James Landale. Hello, James.
Hello.
Have you been off gallivanting for work or because it's your summer holiday?
I've been gallivanting largely for holiday.
Okay, I think that's allowed considering the amount of the other gallivanting that you do.
But I've definitely made sure I had a staycation. My idea of holiday is not going to an airport.
Having to apply for a diplomatic visa. Someone who else is gallivanting, though, today is Andy Burnham, Prime Minister. This is his first foreign trip, and he's going to Ukraine. We'll talk about the substance of the diplomacy in a minute, but you've done that train journey quite a few times, haven't you? I've never been on it. What's it like?
It's kind of strange. You fly to a Polish small airport stroke military base, and normally, you know, sort of what I call those sort of semi-domestic military sort of flights that prime ministers fly on, and then there's a short sort of vehicle move, as they say in the phrase, about half an hour in a car, that gets you to a little train station right on the border, and there, normally it's at night. And there's something sort of, Graham Greene, Stemble train, sort of Orient Express about it.
Yes.
There are these tall trains that you have to climb up to get into. And it's dark and it's quite short because obviously it's just, a few carriages and a locomotive. The style of this sort of where all the leaders are is sort of 1970s kitsch. There's a lot of golden bling and burgundy carpet
and wood paneling,
and stuff like that. But it works, and there's a sort of a whole load of sleeper compartments that you sort of get into. There's normally some complete security madness where everybody, the security people try and take your phones off you and things like that, which normally is not always easy. And then you arrive into Kyiv and the station's pretty central and away you go.
So that's the journey Andy Burnham was making on Sunday, arriving in Kyiv for the start of the week on his first foreign trip. The real kind of hard diplomatic outcome of this trip seems to be about defence equipment.
Yeah, in terms of the UK announcement, what they've announced is that the UK is going to basically give Ukraine the right to make a medium to long range missile called the Scalp or the Storm Shadow that at the moment is made by France and Britain together. Basically, the UK, along with France, have agreed to hand over the blueprints, the know-how, so that in the future, Ukraine can make these missiles by themselves. And so another sort of, step change. It's pretty similar to what Donald Trump initially promised to do with Patriot interceptor missiles that he's now sort of rode back on since. Essentially, it's because in the long run, it's cheaper for the West, is if you give Ukraine the know-how, they can do it themselves.
That to me sounds like quite a long-term project rather than an immediate thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a long-term project because obviously, factories don't magic themselves out of air. You've got to set up these production lines. You've got to work out how it all works. Then you've got to have somebody on the ground say, well, no, we do it like that. You don't want to do it like that. You want to do it like this. There's a sort of
this could be years away.
So we're talking
first homegrown one.
We're talking something. At the moment, Ukraine has been using these missiles for some time. They are what I call the medium to long range. Their range is about 150 miles. So they're cruise missiles. They're launched by aircraft, and what they are is they're better than drones at taking out well-defended military positions, bunker busting, stuff like that. What they're not are long-range ballistic missiles that can reach all the way to Siberia.
Yeah, right. But they could be used to strike targets inside Russia.
Absolutely. Certainly they have been used highly effectively within occupied Crimea and also within sort of, Russia proper.
And what has happened kind of between the UK and France that means they've made this decision? Or is this just another way of supplying Ukraine and looking like they're supportive when actually it's getting harder to find things to supply them with?
Well, there's always a certain tension between the French and the British, as there has been on a lot of these things over the years, because the French have talked a good game, but the British have given more in substance in terms of actual money and munitions. But actually on this, the suggestion is actually the French have been slightly more forward-leaning and saying, look, we need to move on this and give them, the Ukrainians, the right and the ability to do this. There's obviously, there are risks, because obviously the more you spread this technology, the more you lose control over it, and you don't know where in whose hands it might end up. If there is a spy in the Ukrainian system that is might hand it to the Russians, that makes it easier for the Russians to defend against it, blah, blah, blah. So there are clearly risks whenever you expand the purview of this kind of technology. But on the other hand, it's a very cost-effective way of supporting Ukraine in the long run and demonstrating. And also when you're a new prime minister, you want to turn up with a gift. This is the gift.
And do the Ukrainians really want this? Or would they rather have, as you mentioned earlier on, the Patriot missile interceptor technology, which they're running low on?
The Ukrainians will never say no to any technology.
Right.
And they certainly like the idea of being able to make it themselves. Because the point is, and that's good even for the UK in the long run as well, because in 15, 20 years' time, European defence is going to be dominated by Ukraine. And so we need, we need to have given them our systems so that in the future we can get different systems off them. There's a real trade in information here.
Well, no, in 20 years' time, Ukraine will be the kind of defence workshop for the continent of Europe, won't it?
Yeah, if on the assumption that the conflict has reached some kind of settlement. But in terms of your point about the interceptor missiles, yes, in terms of what Ukraine wants more now, and President Zelensky made that very clear in his speech this morning, is he wants more interceptor missiles that are delivered by the Patriot system, because what they do is they can defend Ukraine against Russian ballistic missiles. These are the ones that have the longer range, they carry a powerful punch, and the interceptor drones that Ukraine uses to take out, drones and things like that, they don't work against ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles. They are just going too fast. And at the moment, Ukraine is really suffering. And this is the wound that Russia is punching again and again and again. And that is Ukraine's real vulnerability at the moment.
And in terms of the international diplomacy, the Kremlin said this was the UK pouring petrol on the flames of the conflict. And Andy Burnham responded to that like this.
Who started the fire? That's the question, isn't it? Ukraine did not do that. Russia began this illegal invasion, and that is absolutely clear, and they could stop it at any given time. Britain will never be a fair weather friend. People would expect me to be out here showing our unflinching support, and that's what I'm doing.
So, James, what's your take on how Andy Burnham has been handling this bit of his job thus far?
Well, it's the first real foray into the foreign field. His initial focus has been almost entirely domestic. It has been largely, handing out free gifts and promises, more devolution, a bit of more cash here, a tax break there. This is something that he knows he has to do. Remember, he's the fifth British Prime Minister that Zelensky has had to deal with since the full-scale invasion by Russia 4.5 years ago. So there is definitely a ritual to Burnham's visit. This is what British prime ministers do and have to. And the messaging is not just, though, for Ukraine to ensure continuity. It is also a message from the UK to other European allies that the British position is not going to change. And it was very interesting, of course, that Mr. Burnham was on the same train as a lot of the European officials and leaders, and the picture of him, sort of hugging Mr. Costa and things like that.
Who's the president of the European Council.
And so this is also a message to the rest of Europe that things are not going to change. And that has wider consequences for Britain's wider relations with the Europeans, which we know Andy Burnham wants to try and see if he can shape in a slightly different way to Keir Starmer. So there's all of that. I thought Andy Burnham's speech this morning, was clearly well communicated. It went down well. It provoked applause. It was the sense you got was that it was not just. It was seen as as ever, as we've seen with Andy Burnham, a little bit more emotional investment in something. It provoked an emotional response in the audience. I think the big challenge and question, and this is one that we simply don't know the answer to, is that it's one thing to promise Ukraine rhetorical support, but the UK, whoever is in power, is going to have to be giving Ukraine military support for years to come. Even if the war was settled tomorrow, the UK and other allies are going to be providing Ukraine with military support to help deter future Russian aggression. And all of that is going to require substantial additional expenditure in defence.
And Starmer had made some big commitments to that. I mean, they were sort of virtual commitments because it's not a situation that exists yet, but there were big commitments.
There were big commitments to that. And when Andy Burnham said this morning that, the UK will continue to meet all its commitments to Ukraine, the question will be how much of the defence commitments that Keir Starmer made about meeting the NATO target Andy Burnham will actually make, because one of the big questions we'll be looking at the budget later on this year is what does he say about defence spending? And because the point is that will involve trade-offs and choices, and that Mr. Burnham will have to upset a part of the electoral demographic, because he's going to say you're going to have less of that because we're going to have more on defence, and that is a space that I haven't seen him get into yet, and I genuinely don't know which way he'll jump.
And talking of commitment, what's the British government's commitment to Zelensky? Because obviously in the past they were 100,000% behind him. However, now domestically, so we've had months and months of the corruption stuff that Zelensky's had to deal with, and now his former defence minister, who got fired, has come out last week saying, "Oh, maybe we should think about having elections even while the war is still on," which is something that Zelensky's always opposed because he says the constitution doesn't allow him to do that. How does the UK handle the fact that Ukrainian domestic politics is becoming more kind of normal now?
The UK has always been heavily involved in talking to Ukraine behind the scenes about what's going on domestically and how things are happening. Not in terms of lecturing, in terms of saying you must do this, that, and the other, but in terms of, overtly, the public support has always been, 100% commitment to Zelensky, blah, blah, blah. But behind the scenes, the British government has been repeatedly putting pressure on the government in Kyiv to say, look, you've got to shift on civic society stuff. You've got to maintain your momentum for reform. So you've got to clean out the judiciary. You've got to make sure the anti-corruption organisations are working well. I remember once at a summit seeing not quite a stand-up row, but I remember. Do you remember that Zelensky had an official called Andrei Yermak?
Yes.
Now discredited and has left the government. Was sacked by Zelensky because of his link to a corruption scandal. I remember seeing a very diminutive, I won't name him, British official who normally was very, very, quiet and reserved. A classic.
Do you mean diminutive as in like not very tall?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. And because Andrei Yermak is a big man, know that. And I remember seeing this little official waving his finger very vigorously, very firmly at Yermak, and Yermak looking quite sort of like. And so that relationship has always been there. I think that. I mean, look, the British government does not want there to be elections, but they do want Zelensky to maintain legitimacy, and they do want popular support to remain. Look, Ukraine is a democratic state and polity. There are lots of different views, and when I'm in Ukraine, I'm going back there shortly. I go to a lot of what I call sort of parties where the whole sort of what I call civil society is at, and they will spend the entire evening over their beers moaning about Zelensky. He hasn't done this, he hasn't done that. There's this corruption, like that. But very few of those people would say, "But we need an election now," because it's the logistics, the law, the political risk, the physical risk. Everybody knows it's a non-starter.
So what's this guy doing then? The former defence secretary? Why is he? Is he just playing politics and actually he has to be seen to be calling for this? Or he can call for it knowing full well it's not going to happen and he's just sort of playing his role in the debate to do that?
I mean, he in his interview with the BBC in the last couple of days denied this is all about his own personal politics. He represents a view. And he is, will be seen by some as a representative of the future of, will there come a time when Ukraine moves from a comedian-termed wartime leader who used to run a TV studio into a younger, more technologically minded, more, with a completely different outlook, who has Elon Musk's personal phone number on his speed dial, right? Does Ukraine move to that kind of leadership in the future? That may happen. I think Fedorov will be part of that mix. I mean, I've had a cup of coffee with him in the past when he was still defence minister, and I was struck at the time of just how sort of young and the conversation we had was the sort of conversation I have with I don't know what's the nice way of saying a tech bro, but people who are younger than me, who understand more about technology than me, who have a
proper digital native,
but portable, exactly, in a way that is sort of a slightly sort of more mature.
Anyway, he's going to have a potentially quite long political career. So this was not the end of his political career. Let's put it that way.
But I think that there's definitely a sense that he's overreached himself by calling so explicitly for elections, because everybody knows it's a non-starter.
Yeah, interesting. And if I sound a little bit different in this second half of this episode of Newscast, it's because we've relocated studios because Americast booted us out of the classic Newscast studio. And if you watch on YouTube, you'll be able to see that it looks really different, much more brightly lit, and no comfy chairs. And if you're listening, well, it just sounds slightly different. Also, it's quite ironic that Americast has booted us out in a sort of power struggle between podcasts, because that kind of mirrors what's happening between the US and its northern neighbour Canada right now. They were having talks to try and reach a trade deal to settle their existing differences on trade. Those talks broke down on Friday night, and very quickly Donald Trump retaliated by saying, I'm going to put loads of tariffs, import taxes on Canadian goods. So the relationship between Canada and the US has sunk even further into the mud. Two people now can help us unravel what's going on and give us some pointers about what might be coming next, and also just calculate the cost to both economies either side of the border. Coming back from her holidays, she's back in the Washington Bureau. It's Caitriona Perry. Hello, Caitriona.
Hello, good to speak to you. We're not together like we were in Edinburgh. We're back to our remote relationship again.
Yeah, I miss sharing the stage. We've gone back to long distance. But still plenty to talk about. The conversation will never run dry. And also, please welcome back to Newscast. She's the host of CBC's podcast Front Burner. It's Jayme Poisson. Hello, Jayme.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming back. And are you in Toronto right now?
I am. I'm in Toronto.
Okay, perfect place. Right, as in perfect place to be reporting this story. I wasn't making any coming down on any side in the US-Canadian trade war. So, Caitriona, let's do a little bit of the backstory. Why were Canada and the US negotiating a trade deal in the first place? Just remind us.
Oh, well, this goes way back, doesn't it, to the start of the Trump administration and actually into the past administration, and this kind of the general principle that President Trump has, that he feels that many other nations are taking advantage of the US if they have a trade deficit or a trade surplus, depending on which side of the divide you're standing. So he feels that Canadians are, as he would say, taking advantage of the US, being treated as if they were a state rather than a competitor country. And of course, we've seen him jokingly, or perhaps not, referred to Canada as the 51st state in the past. So there's been a back and forth. Levies have been put on over the last year and a half. Big ones on aluminum and steel, because one of the big trade relationships, and there are many, is how cars are made, particularly those states that are right up there on the Canadian border, like Michigan, Wisconsin, where car parts and materials move back and forth across the border between the two countries until they actually form a car. And it's led to great difficulties about, where the tariffs are levied, how much more expensive do things get, where are you levying the tariff, is it on the part, is it on the finished vehicle, and so on. So we had got to a place last week where there were talks underway. President Trump was saying, we've got a great deal, it's nearly here. He had threatened to put tariffs on booze, alcohol really, Canada cement that's made in Canada, and hockey sticks, which of course a lot of people who play ice hockey in particular want a nice Canadian hockey stick to play with. And the talks went right down to the wire. We thought there was a deal, and all of a sudden there wasn't. And President Trump said these tariffs are going into force, which they did. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, then vowed retaliation. And where we're at the moment is that President Trump has posted just a couple of hours ago on Truth Social to say that 50% tariffs will be levied from the 1st of January next year. not mentioning hockey sticks and alcohol and so on, but actually on that aluminium and that steel and a host of other materials as well. But we know President Trump likes a big long run in. So we have this big long run into January, and presumably there will be some talks happening between now and then.
So Jayme, just to explain this then. So there was the tariffs that were already in place from the existing trade war. There were then tariffs that Donald Trump threatened on Friday because the talks had broken down. But it now sounds like on Truth Social, he's threatened a whole other set of tariffs and it be even more stuff that's even more crucial to the Canadian economy.
Yeah, it's a lot of tariffs. Basically, we had these original tariffs that Caitriona was talking about, which are industry specific. It was hitting steel, aluminum, autos. And then last month, in July, President Trump threatened these additional tariffs, I think probably to try to get these stalled talks moving. We call them 338 tariffs, and they are on like the cement, the hockey sticks, the alcohol, what Caitriona was talking about there.
Even
And
false
those
mustaches, I read.
Yeah,
And
like
wigs.
$28 billion worth of goods, all honey, antiques, under a certain I think under 250 years, some real random stuff as well. And so those went into effect on Saturday after the trade talks fell apart. And now, as of a couple hours ago, we have this new threat of additional tariffs on cars, on aluminum that are set to be placed on Canada starting in January, unless we can figure out a way to avert any of this.
Yeah, because the Saturday morning tariffs were on about, 5% of Canadian exports to the US. And so it sounds like quite a lot in billions of dollars, but actually across the whole Canadian economy, it was quite targeted and narrow. This is a much bigger threat.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And the car industry has already been, or our automobile industry, which is very integrated with the United States, has already been hit quite hard. So like an additional or an increased tariff from 25 to 50% starting in January will obviously be very, very difficult for that industry.
And it's interesting watching the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, like what his rhetoric, just you think he's got to 10 on the dial, but then he dials up a bit more. So he came into office kind of criticizing Donald Trump. That's why he kind of won the election so convincingly. Then we saw that speech he did at the it was the Munich Security Conference, or was it Davos? Yeah, World Economic Forum. Yeah, World Economic Forum in Davos, where he talks about how you just couldn't rely on the US anymore and the middle powers are going to have to group together. And then on Friday night, he's doing that news conference behind the lectern, and he says, this is a war now.
I think that something that perhaps Americans don't fully understand is how angry Canadians have been about the rhetoric and the treatment, that the perceived treatment from the US administration. When Donald Trump came into office and started talking about Canada as the 51st state, it unleashed this anger from the country, and this is a relationship that Canada and the United States have had for decades. We're going into the 25th anniversary of 9/11, for example. On 9/11, we of course gave refuge to, like many Americans that were in the skies and traveling. We fought alongside the Americans in Afghanistan. And so to hear the president talk about us like the 51st state, it just created this outrage in the country. And so that is what Mark Carney is speaking to when you hear him give these speeches. He really is tapping into like public sentiment.
And Caitriona, what have been some? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Caitriona.
I also think in terms of the tit for tat that we've seen going on, and Jayme, you'll know more about this than I do, but President Trump and his team, they don't understand how the Canadian people have really got behind the Prime Minister as well. I mean, so many Canadians have cancelled holidays to America, which would have always been a place, people from both countries would go back and forth. But I've spoken to many Canadians who just say, I'm not spending my money there anymore. And crucially, the Canadian bourbon market and wine coming from California, bourbon coming from Kentucky, they have suffered massive falls in Canada because a lot of the premiers in the various areas have taken them off the shelves, basically. And if they haven't, people just don't buy them anymore because there's really this consumer power of, I'm not spending my money on American goods if this is how we're being talked about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the talks that just broke down, a huge part of it was putting the alcohol back on the shelves. But like you said, I'm not even sure what that would have done, because it's not clear to me that people would have bought it, even if they went back on the shelves of most of the provinces that had taken them off.
And Jayme, are Canadians feeling it in their pockets as well as kind of in their hearts, I suppose?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is a really good question. The polling is very much behind the Prime Minister and fighting back at the moment. But so far, just these specific sectors have really felt the brunt of the tariffs. The automobile industry, for example. So Windsor, Ontario, it's been a really rough time for them, right? But the rest of the country has been, relatively protected. I don't know what happens to public opinion as we see the effects of these new 338 tariffs. You mentioned it's only 5% of our GDP, but it could amount to 90,000 jobs lost, according to some analysis. And if these new tariffs go into January and things get worse here, like I'm not sure what will happen and whether things will shift here on the ground. Canadians haven't yet had to really suffer, right? Or give up anything.
Yeah.
A lot of some, of course, have, and it's been awful, but across the board, not as much.
And I just Googled it as you were talking there. Section 338 is that bit of the law from America in the 1930s that gives Donald Trump the authorization and the power to impose these tariffs, hence why they have that numerical name. Caitriona, how, this is great for my American trade law seminar. Caitriona, how is this going down in American politics then?
I will say that it's August and Congress is out of session. So, there isn't a whole pile of chatter about it just yet, but there will be. And of course, this is something that's been going on for so long, not just with Canada, but we've seen the back and forth of levying tariffs on the European Union and the UK as well, and many other areas. And fundamentally, the way tariffs work is that things will get more expensive for American consumers as well, particularly on those things that they care a lot about, like cars. So the tariffs are unpopular. We obviously saw a Supreme Court ruling earlier in the year which struck down a big chunk of the tariffs. The president was using a different law to try and levy those, and he and his team promised workarounds, which is what we're seeing, and then these 338 ones. And I suspect we will see legal challenges to these ones as well. I mean, Jayme's mentioning Windsor, Ontario, but the area around Detroit, Michigan, just across the bridge there as well, will be really, really harshly impacted by this. It's a swing state, not just for presidential elections, but for, here we are, midterms around the corner again, boom, boom. But, for the Senate, for the members of Congress there as well, these are things that matter. People who are going voting, if they're worried now about their jobs, about the price of things that they're purchasing, that can't have anything other than quite a dramatic impact.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Caitriona, there, the Michigan. I was watching this weekend that it's already sort of coming up in the Senate race there. Abdul Al-Sayed, the Democratic candidate, was just absolutely extremely critical of the tariffs and, lobbying insults at his opponent, the Republican Mike Rogers, saying that he's just like a lackey for Trump, essentially, and that this will be bad for the people of Michigan.
And Caitriona, in terms of Donald Trump's motivation here, is he kind of reacting to something that's happening in America and that's why he's doing this? Or is this all just part of his kind of genuine belief that the deck is stacked against America when it comes to its trade relationship with Canada?
Part of it is that, absolutely. Part of it is a distraction tactic away from the war in Iran. We're expecting a couple of hours after we're taping this podcast that Scott Bessent here, the Treasury Secretary, will be outlining some sanctions on Iran as well. That has less of an impact on American consumers. But, and we've talked about it so often on the pod, haven't we, how sort of badly from an American perspective, getting out of that war effort is going. So anything else that can be talked about in a way is welcome. But it is something that is one of the president's signature campaign promise, this issue of tariffs. And some of them, economically, you can say the US was disadvantaged and things weren't fair when you're looking at it from a global perspective. But that is the very essence of trade. And that's why these trade agreements existed. He vowed to dismantle the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement and put in these sort of bilateral agreements instead. And this is what happens when you're trying to dismantle those and you're not getting what you want and you just decide to kind of take your toys and go home. But we'll see what happens between now and the end of the year. But there's no doubt that consumers in Canada and the US are the ones who pay the price here.
And Jayme, just to fill you in our in-joke, every time me and Caitriona talk on this podcast, we say, oh, the midterms in the US are just around the corner. And this corner has lasted for about 4 months. So it's a very, very long, quite curved corner, actually. More of a bend.
I don't know
We can
how,
almost see the finish line, though.
I don't know the American political reporters do it. I mean, I feel like you're constantly covering an election cycle, but they are around the corner.
Well, Jayme, so good to catch up with you. Thank you for coming on Newscast again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
And Caitriona, I'm glad you came back from your holidays.
Yes, me too. For now, anyway.